Hello, and welcome to another Old Scams and Shiny New Packages podcast. On these podcasts, we use 20th century experiences and ideas to better understand 21st century scams, risk, and potential approaches. My name is John P. Raberger, and I'm here with my podcasting collaborator, Don Wood. Hello, Don.
Hi, John. How are you here in the 21st century?
Good. Today, I would like to talk about privacy and security basics, kind of like a privacy and security 101. Is that okay with you, Don?
Sounds good.
Okay.
Let's do it.
Okay. So, first of all, I'd like to start out with a couple definitions. What is privacy? It's a nebulous term, and it is most popularly defined as the right to be left alone. I think that's a bit of a dated term because I think you can be bothered by somebody in the 21st century who is literally on the other side of the world. So I think that's a bit of a dated term. There's an Internet Association of Privacy Professionals that have a term that it's information privacy is the right to have some control about how your personal information is collected and used. I think that's a really good definition of information privacy. And so how do you make sure that your information is not being used and abused by somebody? And that you have to use tools and techniques that are generally referred to as information security, like doors protect your house, keys protect your car, information security tools like passwords and biometric things and dual authentication protect your information security. And so information security is just the tools and techniques you use. And I think almost everybody uses them. I don't think they think of them as information security, but that's what they are. And the last kind of high-level concept I'd like to talk about is that of risk. The definition of risk is the possibility you might lose control over information that you want to maintain control over. That is, other people might know your secrets, they might know more details about your health or your financial situation or things like that than you wish them to know. That's where the concept of risk come in. And I think these concepts are interrelated. For example, typically the rule of thumb is that the higher risk of a disaster, the more you have to pay attention to it, and the more security controls you put in place to protect your privacy to prevent that bad thing from happening. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. And a couple of thoughts on that. That first definition of privacy that you looked up, the right to be left alone, I agree. That sounds more like liberty to me, the right to be left alone. Privacy is something that you're trying to keep to yourself. And that's sort of different. I think those are two different things. And the other concept I think is important here because it's an overriding concept, John, is the concept of convenience. And it seems to me that as we go through these definitions and the way the world is now in the tech-laden 21st century, the whole thing is about convenience. Humans just can't get enough convenience. And what was really convenient 3 years ago is terribly inconvenient today. And we keep moving the goalposts of convenience, making it ever more convenient for us. And I don't know why that is. It could be that just an innate desire to conserve calories or whatever it happens to be that goes way back into our antiquity. But that whole concept of convenience is really, I think, going to inform our discussion of privacy as we go forward.
That's a really good point. Thanks. I appreciate the input. Another concept related to privacy is the whole legal background surrounding it. Privacy is, in many cases, a legally defined term. Matter of fact, I was looking it up, and 144 countries have enacted national data privacy laws. The United States is not one of them. I think most people would be surprised to learn that there is no explicit right to privacy in the U.S. Constitution. Now, there are laws that have been added after the Constitution was written that give you privacy in some specific areas and domains and activities, but there's no explicit right to it in the Constitution. What happens is people interpret, jurists, important legal people, interpret it as being there, but other people can interpret it as not being there. And from what little I understand, and I'm not a lawyer, that was the core issue behind Roe v. Wade and the Dobbs decision. So I think one of the problems that we in the US in particular have to deal with is there's no explicit right to privacy in the Constitution, and thus all privacy laws and rules are fragmented and all over the place and maybe state level and depends on which industry you're in. And you get almost to things like customs and norms and things like that.
Yeah, it's odd, isn't it, that the United States of America, which was founded on the concepts of liberty, and in our Constitution, we're guaranteed not to have unreasonable searches and seizures and so on, that despite that history in our Constitution, we don't have that overarching right to privacy. And that, I suppose that could be another topic for another day, but it's just one of those little ironies of history that we have to wrestle with as we talk about these topics.
Yeah, I agree. In preparation for this and the other podcasts, we talked about the ideas, and I think you brought up this profound idea that animals innately need privacy. And I think that is a profound idea because to me, if it's an innate instinctual activity, then it is almost above the law. It gets into the life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness kind of thing because yes, it can be a law, yes, it can be a legal attribute, but if it's innate in all animals, then it's something more basic like that. It's something more like sex drive and hunger and fear, because animals don't have laws and animals don't make laws. They just live their animal lives. So would you mind explaining why you think animals need privacy?
Oh, they need to survive. They're under constant threat and stress. They are always mobilized. They don't sleep. I'm thinking of birds in this case. They don't really sleep the way we do. Half of their brain goes to sleep. The other half stays awake as they roost at night. And then I think they switch hemispheres. 4 hours later, the other half goes to sleep and the other is awake because they're constantly worried about being attacked or their eggs being stolen or food supply being made unavailable to them. So they're always in a heightened state of mobilization. And part of that need to protect themselves is privacy. And it's one of those things, John, I don't know, we don't have a periodic table of elements for human behavior, but if we did, I think privacy would be its own element. It's just essential to survival for anybody who finds themselves on this great green earth. And the privacy issue now is more important than ever as we get into these podcasts because we're putting so much of ourselves out there on anonymous servers in distant lands. And it's a concern.
Yeah, I think that's a really good point regarding animals too, in that it's hard for me to think of an animal that does not seek some type of privacy in some situations. And I'm thinking bears, when they hibernate, typically go into caves because they're hiding basically. And to some degree, they want privacy because they don't want to be attacked when they're immobilized asleep. Birds, as you mentioned, build nests high up in the trees, and they make them hard to find and get to and hard to see, which creates a type of privacy for birds. You know, other animals that go hide in caves or disguise themselves with some type of camouflage are really seeking what is sort of a natural version of privacy. And I'm having a hard time thinking of any animal that does not do that. Now, maybe a whale is the closest thing because it's so big and it can eat anything else. But I bet they go to some locations like deep in the ocean. Now, again, I'm speculating here, that are very hard to get to by their predators when they're calving. I bet that's exactly what they seek in terms of privacy because they know that their predators, let's say orca whales or something like that, that might attack them it'd be very hard. Or else they get herd privacy, where like bison probably don't have privacy, but when they roam the American plains, there were literally millions of them. And so no one would really attack millions of bison. No wolf is that brave to attack millions of bison. So they get herd protection. And bees are like that too. I mean, you can see a bee nest, but a bee is very much inside that nest and you can't find it. And so it has privacy and it's all protected by his little bee buddies around him too.
And the
So,
reason they got that way is evolution. Evolution favored and favors those who are really good at camouflage and privacy.
right. I
The
think,
ones that didn't have that were prototypes that quickly became outmoded, didn't exist.
right.
Yeah.
Yeah, they got eaten. They all got eaten up.
And they wouldn't reproduce. You know, the whole thing you mentioned, the calving, the whole thing is about reproduction.
Right. To me, that's a really fascinating insight because that means that if you think we're animals and in the animal's kingdom, and if that's your assumption, then we innately need privacy, whether it's in the US Constitution or not, whether it's in a law or not, whether it's in a rule somewhere, Hammurabi's code or Tacitus from the 2000 BC, it's just innate in terms of what we are. So I think that's a really interesting observation. So the other thing I'd like to point out is that, now this is going to be weird too, is that by design, when the internet was being developed, security was not included in the design of what we now know as the internet. That was on purpose because it was designed to be to use Al Gore's term, an information superhighway where anybody could access it, and they didn't want toll booths on the information superhighway. And there was also this mentality, is that this concept that information wanted to be free. That is, people wanted to have access to this information superhighway and information would flow across it, and that would create a freedom-loving nirvana of information. That's kind of not how it turned out, but that's what if my old brain remembers that far back, that's what the mentality was back then. So any security or encryption you add to the internet is added on top of the internet function. Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
That, to me, that's just an interesting observation.
I was wondering about that as you were talking, because in terms of the security being laid on top of the internet, which already existed. Is that why we went from HTTP to HTTPS?
That's exactly right. HTTPS is Hypertext Transfer Protocol Secure. Now, there's a variety of ways to secure things on the internet, and that's one of them. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I remember whenever America Online came out and everyone was using it, but we didn't really think about security. And then someone said, oh, we'll always make sure when you go on a website and you do something that there's an S there in the address.
That was an attempt to add some level of security to the internet. There's a whole bunch of other things that are added to. For example, if you're dealing with your bank, the bank sets up some kind of security mechanism to communicate with a bank on an app or a website, and that's added on. And there's a whole bunch of other tools, VPNs, virtual private networks, or an encryption, quote, tunnel, end quote, that people use for encryption. There's a whole bunch of things you can do. But yes, there's no innate security baked into the internet. It has to be added on.
I wonder if that was a mistake.
No, I don't think so. And the thinking back then is if you bake a security system into it and it can be broken, the internet security is forever broken. The other thing, too, is that it's a commentary on the idealism of the people in that time and space in the 1970s in US specifically, about their idealism about what the internet was capable of. When it was first developed, there's a lot of idealism associated with the internet, more than people think about it now. And part of that idealism is that if we just built a better way for people to communicate, the world would be a better place.
Oh boy, got that one wrong.
Except I'm not sure we would have the internet now if people were not that idealistic. I think it's a normal progress of technology in anything in life. You're going to have pros and cons, but when you're going through the process, I think I'm not sure there would have been internet if people weren't idealistic about it. So that's a really tough one.
That's sort of an interesting alternate history to think about,
Yeah.
whether or not that was a mistake. You
Well,
know, you'd have to
yeah.
go to other technologies too and ask, well, did they make mistakes when they were invented? Could it have been better? Nevertheless, it does seem like security, even though it's on top of the internet, most of us do our daily business every day, I would think, without leakage or fraud or terrible things happening to us, losing all our money. It seems to work pretty well, even if security is a kind of a layer and it's not really baked into the cake.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think on balance it's very useful, or else it would go away. If it was that threatening, people wouldn't use it anymore.
Right.
And speaking of security baked in, back then in the 80s, IBM, which was the 800-pound gorilla of the computer industry back then, they created their own alternate internet. And the smart money back then was that the IBM version of the internet would be the winner, and that the internet we have today would not be the winner because there were a whole bunch of technical issues with it. And that did have security baked into it, but you could only use IBM computers on that internet. So the mentality back then was that IBM wanted to create its own superhighway, and they were going to be the metaphorical toll gatekeepers, and they were going to make money off this internet. And that's not what people chose, though. People chose the more open and free and maybe slightly less secure internet than the IBM version. And that's not where the smart money was back then. So the fascinating aspect of it is that people chose and the internet grew to be what it is today. And people knew there was no security mechanisms baked into it.
Right. Hmm.
And the other point I'd like to make too is to some extent, individuals have control over their personal level of privacy in the US to some extent. This varies because companies have to deal with the laws of the land and the laws that they do business in. And for example, the EU privacy laws are more restrictive than the US privacy laws. But to some extent, you do have some control. For example, if you just don't put stuff on the internet, it's much less likely to wind up on the internet. Now, it still can be because you can have a company leakage and stuff like that, but it's less likely. There are some laws like HIPAA that in the United States protect people's health, but that only applies to medical service providers. It doesn't apply to us. So I think we do have some control, but I think we have less control in the United States than other places, to be honest with you.
Which is, I don't see that changing. We had our chance, and it doesn't seem like that's happening now.
Well, I think the big reason is that most big tech companies are US based. And that is viewed as contributing to US growth. I mean, high tech is extremely popular. Cell phones are literally everywhere in the world. Internet is almost literally everywhere in the world. So one could say this has been an enormously successful invention. So the big tech companies also have they have a lot of money. I mean, some of them are literally worth $1 trillion in market capitalization. And they have a lot of political clout. And so to change the Constitution to create explicit privacy for US citizens would affect their bottom line. And it would affect it pretty dramatically, and they wouldn't like that because then they would have to have a whole bunch of rules. So I agree that in the United States, it's in the near term, it's certainly unlikely. I think it would have to be a catastrophe of cataclysmic effect for us to change it, but I agree with you.
Which could happen because I think, my mind will go to a disaster that could happen, a D-Day, you call it a data day, where a nefarious actor somewhere holed up in a basement in Pyongyang was able to access all Americans' web browsing and release it all out to the world so everybody could see what everybody was looking at. Now that's sci-fi, that's fantastic, but it's not a non-zero possibility that could happen. And
Yeah.
so with the S added to HTTP, that's really not going to solve that problem. But that's sort of Armageddon thinking. I know it's way off topic from what we're talking about, but it's always possible that that would happen. And if
Sure.
it did, then we'd have to totally rethink how we interact with this new invention.
Yes, I agree. And I think the last point about being a new invention, I think is valid. I think we're basically conducting this big social experiment with the internet in real time because it's the first time in the history of mankind that you can literally communicate for almost nothing with almost anybody else in the world. Not quite, but almost everybody.
It's getting there, and instantly, and lots of data. Growing up, we didn't think in terms of gigabytes.
Right.
And so now we can send those to anybody at any time, and they'll get it instantly.
Exactly. Anything else you'd like to add, Don?
Just one of the things that I'm constantly looking at historical examples, when the automobile was invented and widely adopted, that meant so much freedom and convenience for people who up till then had to rely on trains or horses to get out of town. Once the car was invented and it became something that a lot of people had, then they could leave their small towns, and then they could move, and they could be anonymous, and they could do things on their own without asking their parents' permission. All of these things that today we take for granted. Nevertheless, those cars were extremely dangerous, and they broke down a lot, and you could break your arm by just starting it. Remember those old starters on the front of the car near the radiator? You'd have to turn it, and then all of a sudden it would turn like a propeller. Get your arm out of the way, you'd break your arm. So they were dangerous contraptions, but they were alluring. And getting back to what we were talking about at the beginning, they were really convenient. Over time, safety measures were laid on top of those cars. They weren't part of the cars at the beginning, but they were added. The safety belts, the seat belts, the rear view mirror, the signal lights, the headlights, high beams, and so on. And so that may be what we're seeing with this new, somewhat mysterious and sometimes dangerous contraption known as the internet. And perhaps someday, maybe not in our lifetime, but someday maybe our kids will see this. The internet will be more or less like a really nice, upholstered, and safe car. But in the meantime, I think we're going to talk about these issues dealing with privacy and security, which are so important. And they're important now as the internet is still in its embryonic stage.
Yeah, I think that's a great analogy with the automobile industry because I think that's at least in the United States. I think some places like the European Union with some of their rules and some other countries are a little bit ahead of the curve because there aren't the political pressures from tech companies. But I think that's a great analogy. And that's part of what these podcasts are about, is comparing things that we've learned from in the past, in the 20th century, and applying them to the 21st century. So I applaud your thinking of that analogy because I think that's a very relevant point.
History doesn't repeat, but it rhymes.
Yeah, who said that?
Well, I just did. So I'm going to take credit for it.
I don't think you're the first one, but I can't remember who it was. I'll have to Google
go to the
it.
internet. Go to the internet, John. It'll tell you. Wikipedia will tell you. And I will say Wikipedia does have an HTTPS.
Okay. Well, thank you, Don. I appreciate it. Take care. And I will end this podcast by saying, don't be afraid of modern scams because they're just old scams in shiny new packages. Farewell.